I remember hearing reading somewhere, if a small lie is challenged further, it can stray into far bigger and more serious lies. These lines are accurate, but in my understanding, it suggests one to never lie, even if it's a white one. In my experience, sometimes lying is necessary to avoid chaos, such as when you're trying to spare someone's feelings from laughing at a joke you didn't find funny, or if there are some lies spoken to protect yourself for someone else. Whether it is a correct one that shouldn't lie, but sometimes with a good cause in mind that doesn't harm others, lying isn't bad. Up until my teenage years, I hated the tale of Pinocchio. Not only because the 1940s movie I saw felt alarming as a kid, but also for the tale's misguided morals by people. While I understand now as an adult that the lessons were about being a good kid, telling us not to listen to strangers, focus on learning, and never take the easy way out, what I always heard was never to lie or your nose would end up like Pinocchio. Not just from my parents, but from my teachers as well. Trust me, the feeling it planted inside me was terrifying, which made my childhood a mess, because with the constant fear in my mind that my nose would grow large, I didn't lie at all, not even the small little white ones. That was the reason I couldn't make friends until I learned to lie, when needed judging by the called situation. Even after realizing the correct morals of the tale, I never could come to like the story, and still felt the same, looking at how I would never be able to get free from the guilt that someone ended up dead because of that. I would be 7 or 8 at the time, and I was a pretty naive kid even at that age. As I mentioned earlier, I couldn't make friends because I seemed like a rude brat to others. There was also the factor of moving around a few times because of my father's job, which would also add to the list of hard things I went through. Anyway, it was the 3rd time we moved, and I was transferred to a different school. But as always, I couldn't make the first impression, looking at how I could lie politely past a few kids' weird appearances. I didn't understand why teachers ask such things as to compliment others on the first day to make friends when we don't even know them. I felt like an outsider in that school, looking at how I didn't know any of them. At least in my previous school, there was Ricky, who was sort of my friend, and needless to say, the kids here treated me as an outsider too. On the 6th day of school, a girl approached me who seemed rather cute, but I couldn't talk to her and just walked away, because I knew I would only make it worse if she asked me any questions. The girl seemed to have a reputation for being overly friendly and the cheerful type, which made sense looking at how she approached me even after hearing all the gossip and continued passing me smiles every time our eyes met. There were bullies in every school, doesn't matter where you go, and it was the same with this school as well. And I had become the major target because of my explicit honesty, so I started getting beaten up every once in a while. At the time, I had no idea how this school had more bullies than an average one, and as a result, the school's janitor, who was probably in his 20s, was getting the same treatment as me by the older kids. It was one day when I was in class, I noticed that same cute girl who tried to talk to me. She looked pale, probably under the weather or something. That was when the janitor walked in looking like a raging bull with a gun in his hands. Kids started screaming and running out of the classroom, leaving the girl who hid under a bench and me sitting on the desk frozen. "Where is that jerk, sister? How dare he hurt my Bella? I will show him how it feels to lose someone you love," he started screaming and looking around the classroom like some psycho on the loose. I knew Bella was the stray cat who I noticed him feeding a few times, but I couldn't understand why he was making such a fuss over her. "Hey kid, have you seen a girl with red hair?" he asked me while pointing a gun at me. Unable to understand what to say since telling the truth would only harm the red-headed girl hiding under the last desk, I stayed silent. "Don't test my patience. I won't hesitate to shoot you." As he threatened me with a growling voice, it made a shiver run down my body. I nodded in yes. "Good boy. Now tell me where she is," he asked against gritted teeth. Tears started falling from my eyes. I started crying loudly, because I knew where she was, and I didn't want to tell him. But if I lie, my nose would grow longer, which would make him know about the truth and he would shoot both of us. As I noticed him putting his finger on the trigger, I got scared that he was going to shoot me first, so I pointed my finger in the girl's direction while bawling my eyes out. The man walked there at a slow and frightening pace and grabbed the girl's hair, pulling her outside. I remember seeing the girl's face paler in comparison to what I saw earlier as she removed her stuffed hands from her mouth and let out a scream. "Sorry, kid. It's not your fault. I'm only doing this because your brother is making my life hell, and this school needs to know what bullies can do to people like me who have IED. These words followed a loud bang, along with the girl's scream, which went silent after a few seconds. I remember collapsing from the sudden trauma, which was too much for a 7-year-old, and then I woke up in the hospital. I didn't speak a word for a few days. I didn't want to go back to school either, since I blamed myself for her death. But most importantly, I learned my lesson that always telling the truth can cause problems as well as lying does. I felt even worse when my nose didn't grow when I lied for the first time, even though I was secretly hoping it would, realizing I could have saved her life. My guilt was turning into hatred toward Pinocchio, and ever since then, I started learning about the white lies until I became good at them. I still stand by the morals of not lying, but the line that I added to the moral is lying isn't always bad if done with good intentions. There was once this story about Pinocchio that a man wrote. It was one of the grittiest and most sadistic things that I have ever read. The story was definitely not the child-friendly Disney version of the Pinocchio, but it was rather a sadistic version of it. And then some often argue even that the sadistic story that I have heard is the real story and not the Disney one. Even though the Disney story is more hopeful and cheerful, there's definitely something about the sadistic story that is much more real, and the chances of it being closer to reality trumps over the chances of the Disney one being real. The story starts with a man who brought in a doll from a county fair and kept it in the basement of his house. It was said the man that bought the doll wasn't really stable when it came to everyday social situations. He was bit slowly when it came to things, and he was labeled a creep in the town. Kids of the town didn't really help by bullying him constantly, and because of that, the condition that he was in was even worse than it was before, and it made him more secluded from everyone else. It all spiraled to when the man was pushing into becoming a loner, and that is when he started this friendship with the dolls and started talking to them, and his parents did see that, and even tried to get him out talking and meeting people in real life, but he tried that before, and people were not ready to accept him out in the society, and then he became a complete shut-in. It was then that his conversations started out with the dolls that he was collecting. He would start talking to them in front of the people, but every other time he did talk to them. He must have been the college age when he started keeping those dolls, and it soon became something he did very often and became the collector of the creepy dolls. It wasn't until the late summer when things changed for him. It was the mid-1800s, and the time was much harder than it was today. So some people, while he was walking out with his dolls in his hands, he was crossing the river stream passing by, when some of the guys in his town saw him, and they decided to gang up on him and bully him. He wasn't sure what he did wrong, and there was nothing that he could even do to stop that feeling. So he just crawled himself into a hamster ball and got beaten by those guys from the town. He stayed there motionless as long as he could. He just wanted the guys to go away. And when they realized that he isn't really reacting to anything, they just left away, kicking his dolls. And as they did, a man in a suit picked up the doll and looked at it and asked him as he was lying down, "Now, young man, is this your friend?" And as the man looked up as he heard the word friend, he realized that the man was not a danger. And then he looked and just slightly nodded. The man in the suit said, "Well, young man, I'm going to pay you $1,000 for this doll and teach you how to make them if you wish so." The man had no idea about anything, and he just said yes and followed him. The man showed him around the factory, and that is where he learned how to make really amazing dolls, and he was especially interested in the ceramic dolls, and most importantly, was able to find a career out of this, and went on to manufacture dolls and became an integral part of the manufacturing company. And then one day, when he had enough money, he left the company, thanked the man for his help, and decided to open up a small workshop of his own in his basement, or even buy a warehouse. He later went on to establish a workshop of ceramic doll manufacturing in his basement, and then bought a warehouse, and that is how he started his own company of dolls. It had been 10 years since he had started this, and he even had the support of the man who gave him the job when he was found down beaten by the bullies. But even after becoming so successful and rich, it wasn't enough for the people to shut up, and they went on to bully him even then. And even after the success, the people of the town looked down at him, as he was the same old man who talked to the dolls in his basement. And the man this time seemed to take it quite well. He said nothing and did nothing about it, and just focused on his work. One day, while he was coming back from his workshop, one of the bullies who bullied him years ago was strolling around with his kid, and he decided to bully him again to impress his child. He took the doll from his hands, and the bully father told his son, "Be anything you like, but don't be this creep, all right, son?" And he snatched the doll from the hand of the man, and then stomped on it, breaking it, and then went on to beat the man. This time, the man was angry, and it was almost as if that he was done by all that bullying he had been going through, and he decided to do something so vigorous that it would make his bullies regret that they ever laid a hand on him. He was a man of money now and success, so getting things wasn't really something very difficult. So he did what he knew the best. He threw some money around and acquired the family information on all his bullies. And then, when he was done with it, he hired 3 muscles, really strong big guy that could not be challenged by any of his bullies, and then ordered them to kidnap the kids of every single bully that rattled him when he was a kid. They brought the kids to the warehouse, and then the man went on to carefully turn every kid into a ceramic doll, and he did carefully where the kids won't suffocate, but couldn't even do anything. He then wrote a letter to every single one of his bullies that he has made them dolls, and they surely must want. They came and they tried threatening the man, but he was now with the big muscles. Then he said to them, "You have been bullying me for my dolls, and now I am going to bully you for your dolls. Your kids have been carefully turned into dolls. If you want your dolls to be alive again, bring the deed to everything you own and name it to me." At first they didn't believe him, but then he brought out one of the dolls and then hammered it, and the king came out of it and started running to his father. And the man said, "Well, William wasn't too much of a bully, and to be honest, he is too poor. I cannot really get anything from him, so I am letting his kid go, just to set an example. So hurry up, guys. Bring in your deeds." They all were very helpless in that moment and went and brought in the deeds for their house, farm, cattle, or anything they owned. And the man was quite joyous to see that, and he took all the deeds and set them on fire, and then brought out the dolls and ordered the muscles to break them all carefully and said, "There you go. Make your dolls real." Hey guys, thanks so much for all the support. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please feel free to do so.
Alexander Bean was born in the Scottish country of East Lothian. Sometime during the 16th century, his father was employed as a laborer, with duties mostly consisting of ditch digging and hedge trimming. Alexander tried to follow in his father's footsteps and take up the family trade, but realized rather quickly that the hard work and measly pay did not suit him. He is also said to have attempted to train as a tanner and become proficient in the process of treating the skins and hides of animals to produce leather. The modernity and paltry wages caused him to become fed up with the profession. But it seems he learned skills that he carried with him into later life. Skills that would not only just provide a means of living, but a great deal of infamy too. Alexander was not like other people. He was rough, ill-tempered, and violent, and he felt he simply did not belong around regular folk. So when he met a girl of similar inclinations named Agnes Douglas, nicknamed Black Agnes, due to word shock of black hair, as well as her distinctly dark personality, he knew he'd found his soulmate. Alexander's mother and father strongly objected to their union, having heard rumors that Black Agnes practiced witchcraft. So they told their son that he would be forbidden from living in the family home with his new belle should they choose to wed. The couple then chose to elope, leaving East Lothian and traveling across the Scottish lowlands, moving from place to place and surviving on what little work each of them could find. But the couple grew contemptuous of their employers, as well as the work they were doing, and one night they hatched a plan to earn some easy money. They would lay in wait at a crossroads near to a tavern, ambushing, murdering, and robbing weary travelers as they trudged towards what they assumed to be a safe haven for the night. The couple's dark deeds then took an even darker turn, when at one point, during a robbery and murder in Ayrshire, they decided on an easy way to cut their cost. Instead of using the money they stole from the victims to buy food, they would simply turn their victims into food by dragging their corpses before butchering and eating them. Alexander was used to dealing with corpses of animals, and found the human corpse were all too similar to the ones he'd worked with during his tanner training. After one such incident, Agnes and Alexander dragged off the body of their victims to a coastal clave in a benign head between Gerve and Ballantrae. It was there they made a fire in which they roasted the poor soul's limbs, feasting on the flesh once it was properly cooked. The cave was almost 200 meters deep, and the couple discovered that during high tides, the entrance was almost completely blocked off to outsiders. They had managed to find themselves the perfect home, a subterranean lair from which they could launch raids into the nearby countryside, and one they could retreat to after the grisly crimes to avoid being apprehended by the law. The couple lived in the cave completely undiscovered for more than 25 years. Agnes and Alexander raised a family there, producing 8 sons and 6 daughters, who in turn birthed 18 grandsons and 14 granddaughters, all of which were products of inter-family breeding. What began as a small family grew into something that more resembled an actual clan, and as time went on, the Bean family turned their bloody work into an industry of robbery, murder, and cannibalism. They began to strip on remaining scraps of meat and organs from the victims, pickling the leftovers in barrels so they could more easily survive during the harsh Scottish winters. They also employ the rather shrewd strategy of tossing the skeletal remains of their quarry into the sea. The bones then would be washed up on beaches far from the coastal cave they called home, leading terrified villagers to believe that it was, in fact, animals that were attacking and eating travelers at completely different locations, effectively throwing them off the beaten family scent altogether. Naturally, the frequent disappearances did not go unnoticed by the local villagers, but the Bean family remained hidden in their cave during the day and only ever ventured out under the cover of darkness to claim their victims. The methods are so furtive that the villagers were completely unaware that there was a group of murderous cannibals living right under their noses. As the years went by, more and more villagers seemingly vanished from the face of the earth, and the more they did, the more the local population seemed to take note. Eventually, several organized searches were undertaken in an attempt to find those responsible for the vanishings. During one such search, it is said that a group of men noticed the coastal cave that the Bean family had called home, but were unable to believe that anything human could survive in it, and thus failed to properly explore it. But if they had, they would have discovered horrors beyond their imagining. Unable to locate the culprits, the local townsfolk became incredibly frustrated and volatile in their quest for justice. They actually ended up lynching several innocent people, brutally executing them in spite of their pleas for mercy, and totally ignoring their insistence that they were guiltless. They often suspected local innkeepers since they almost always happened to be the last people to see the victims alive. Several were dragged from their homes in the middle of the night and hung from branches of large trees nearby. Still, the disappearances had continued. And then one night, as a married couple was returning from a local county fair on horseback, the Bean family spied their approach. They ambushed the couple, dragging the wife from her mount and savaged her as she lay in the road. Then they tried to do the same to her husband, but found he was not so easy to be overpowered. Little did they know that he was a former militiaman who was skilled in combat and carried a sword and pistol whenever he went out riding. The husband was able to hold off his attackers, but as he did so, he was forced to listen to the blood-curdling screams of his wife as the Bean family tore into her with knives and hatchets, carving her up while she was still alive. Eventually, after the husband had dispatched a fair few of the Bean family himself, a group of travelers who were also returning from the very same county fair appeared on the same trail and were horrified to have stumbled on the grisly scene that lay before them. They ran to assist the former militiamen, chasing the Bean family away with their superior numbers before escorting the newly made widower to the local magistrate to tell them of what he had experienced. Upon hearing the pure animal ferocity of the attack and how the poor, murdered wife of the former militiaman had been carved up and butchered while she was still alive, the magistrate seemed convinced that those responsible for the many disappearances over the years had finally been discovered. With local authorities sounding the call to arms, it wasn't long before none other than the Scottish King James VI heard of the horrifying atrocities. He subsequently made the decision to personally lead a search of over 600 men and several bloodhounds on a quest to find and eradicate the Bean family once and for all. Using clothing from the bodies of the slain Bean family member taken from the site of the recent county fair ambush, the bloodhounds were able to track a scent trail which led all the way back to the previously overlooked coastal cave, a benign head. Using flaming torches to illuminate the cave's dark interior, the king's men found the Bean family surrounded by the spoils of their blood-soaked pillaging. Piles of stolen heirlooms, jewelry, clothing, and gold coins littered the ground around them. But what lined the walls of the cave made the kingsmen's blood turn to ice in their veins. Chunks of meat, human meat, hung dry from ropes that were strung above their heads. Barrel after barrel was stuffed with pickled human organ meat. The smell was enough to turn a man's stomach, but it wasn't nearly as disturbing as the inbred features of the clan that cowered before them. The majority of the family, mostly women and girls, were captured alive without a fight and dragged wailing from the cave by the furious king's men. But many of the men and boys ran into the depths of the cave and refused to come out, barking out that they would kill any man that tried to take them. Instead of risking their lives to root them out, the king's men placed gunpowder at the cave's entrance, blowing the opening sky high and ensuring that anything that remained inside would surely suffocate. Those that were captured were initially taken to jail in Edinburgh before being transferred off to Glasgow. Their captors were extremely disturbed by the family's lack of humanity, both in their physical appearance as well as in their morality, seeing them as no better than animals. The king's men subjected the Bean family to summary executions, believing they were too inhumane to even store in proper jail. Alexander Bean, the family patriarch, was subjected to a terrible retribution for the crimes he had masterminded. The king's men cut off his private parts and burned them before his eyes, a visual metaphor that he would never again pass on this rotten seed. He then had his hands and feet severed and was made to bleed to death, a slow and painful end to a truly evil man. As he was dying, he supposedly screamed out, "It isn't over! It will never be over," hinting that some of the family had actually survived the raid by the king's men. After this, Agnes and the rest of the women, along with a number of the Bean children, are tied to stakes and burned alive. There may have been some truth to Alexander's claims that some of his ilk had survived the raid, as in the nearby town of Gabon. There are those that speak of a woman who appeared amongst the populace, not long after the raid of the Bean's coastal cave home. Apparently, after being interrogated by the locals regarding her origins, she admitted to being an escaped member of the Bean family, who were, by that point, infamous for their murder and debauchery. She was reportedly taken to a nearby tree and hung from a bough while the Gabon mob roared with approval. Over the years that followed, truth passed into rumor, which in turn passed into legend. And these days, there are so many who dispute that Alexander Bean and his cannibalistic family even existed. The fact that Alexander earned the nickname Sonny Bean during the time that followed is a derogatory name given the Scots by their English neighbors. There's quite a flimsy argument that the whole story was concocted by Englishmen simply to give Scotland a bad name, but a remarkably similar account can be found in a book by Nathaniel Crouch, a compiler of popular history writer, who published his work in the year of 1696. In it, he tells the tale of an incident which supposedly happened in 1459, the year before King James II's death. A passage from it reads as follows: "A thief who lived privately in a den with his wife and children were all burned alive, having made it their practice for many years to kill young people and eat them. Only one girl of the family was saved and brought up to the Dundee, who at 12 years of age was found guilty of the same horrid crime when great multitudes witnessed her execution. Wondering at her unnatural villainy, she turned toward them and with a cruel countenance said, 'What do you thus rail at me, as if I had done such a heinous act contrary to the nature of men? I tell you that if a few did know how pleasant the taste of man's flesh was, none of you would forbear to eat it.' And thus, with an impenitent and stubborn mind, she suffered a deserved death." What's clear from this testimony is that even if some of the details have gotten confused or twisted over the course of centuries that followed, there was indeed a family of cannibals up in Scotland, maybe even more than one. A family that didn't just eat human flesh because they were forced to do so out of poverty, but because they actually enjoyed it.